So this next section is Unit 1, Section 2, and it is about the spread of Islam throughout the period of 1200 to 1450. After the death of Muhammad in 632, Islam spread rapidly outward from Arabia. Through military actions and the activities of merchants and missionaries, Islam's reach extended from India all the way to Spain. We see a certain element of modernism within this time period of Islam. They certainly had tolerance towards other religions, especially Jews and Christians, who they considered believed in a single God and did good works. Under the Abbasid dynasty that precedes this time period, Islam reached a golden period of scholarship where many scholars from all over the world went to Baghdad to study in the House of Wisdom. The Islamic community helped then transfer knowledge throughout Afro-Eurasia. When the Abbasids declined, they were simply replaced by other Islamic states. So this is a period of invasions and shifts in trade routes, and certainly our Islamic dynasties will confront the same old problem with nomadic groups. After the death of Muhammad in 632, Islam spread rapidly outward from Arabia. Through military action and the activities of merchants and missionaries, Islam's reach extended from India to Spain. Many Islamic leaders showed tolerance to Christians, Jews, and others who believed in a single God and did good works. Under the Abbasid Empire, scholars traveled from far away to Baghdad to study at a renowned center of learning known as the House of Wisdom. The Islamic community helped transfer knowledge throughout Afro-Eurasia. When the Abbasids declined, they were replaced by other Islamic states. In the 1100s and 1200s, the Abbasid Empire confronted many challenges. Like the Chinese, they had conflicts with nomadic groups in Central Asia. Unlike the Chinese, they also confronted European invaders. Arab rulers often purchased enslaved people, or Mamluks, who were frequently ethnic Turks from Central Asia. They recruited them to serve as soldiers and later as bureaucrats. Because of their roles, Mamluks had more opportunity for advancement than did most enslaved people. In Egypt, Mamluks seized control of the government, establishing the Mamluk Sultanate from 1250 to 1517. They prospered by facilitating trade in cotton and sugar between the Islamic world and Europe. However, when the Portuguese and other Europeans developed new sea routes for trade, the Mamluks declined in power. Another challenge to the Abbasids came from the Central Asian Seljuk Turks, who were also Muslims. Starting in the 11th century, they began conquering parts of the Middle East, eventually extending their power almost as far east as western China. The Seljuk leader called himself Sultan, thereby reducing the role of the highest-ranking Abbasid from caliph to mere chief Sunni religious authority. The Abbasids had allowed Christians to travel easily to and from their holy sites in and around Jerusalem. However, the Seljuk Turks limited this travel. European Christians organized groups of soldiers called crusaders to reopen access. And as you can see from this map, they are going to significantly, we're going to see a mass change of ideas as a result. Europe before 1096 had been in a really dark period, as we're going to learn in section 1.6. But certainly this crusade, while its main goal was to take Jerusalem, had several other purposes. One, it solved the problem of what to do with the other children, the sons that don't inherit all the land. And the other thing it did was it kept all these countries in Europe from fighting each other, and it gave them a common enemy. Where am I going? It gave them a common enemy. And of course, the Pope is going to push forward these crusades, and we'll talk about them more in a future section. And lastly, this is really the last big confrontation between settled civilizations versus nomads. The nomads in this case are the Mongols, and the civilizations that existed are going to be China, India, Persia, areas of the Middle East, and almost Europe. I mean, the Mongols certainly take Russia, but they almost get Europe and then are stopped really probably by disease. So it's the Mongols. This is the fourth group to attack the Abbasid Empire. They were among the most famous conquerors in history. The Mongols, like many of the other groups that were nomadic at the time, the Mamluks and the Seljuk Turks, came from Central Asia. The Mongols conquered the remaining Abbasid Empire in 1258 and ended the Seljuk rule. They continued to push westward but were stopped in Egypt by the Mamluks. Since the 8th century, the Abbasids had been an important link connecting Asia, Europe, and North Africa. Goods and ideas flowed from one region to another on trade routes controlled by the Abbasids. Many went through Baghdad. However, trade patterns slowly shifted to routes further north. As Baghdad lost its traditional place at the center of trade, it lost wealth and population. It could not afford to keep its canals repaired. Farmers could not provide enough food for the urban population. Slowly, the infrastructure that had made Baghdad a great city fell into decay. Over time, the Islamic world fragmented politically. Many of these new states adopted Abbasid practices, but they were distinct ethnically. The Abbasid Caliphate was led by Arabs and Persians, but the later Islamic states were shaped by Turkic peoples who descended from people in Central Asia. For example, the Mamluks in North Africa, the Seljuks in the Middle East, and the Delhi Sultanate in South Asia were all at least partially Turkic. By the 16th century, 3 large Islamic states had their roots in Turkic cultures: the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the Mughal Empire in India. However, these Islamic states continued to form a cultural region. Trade spread new goods and fresh ideas. The common use of Sharia law created similar legal systems. Great universities in Baghdad, Iraq, Cordoba, Spain, Cairo, Egypt, and Bukhara in Central Asia created centers for sharing intellectual innovations. Islamic scholars followed the advice of the Prophet Muhammad when he said, "Go in quest of knowledge even unto China." By learning from many cultures, they carried on the work of earlier thinkers. They translated Greek literary classics into Arabic, saving the works of Aristotle and other Greek thinkers from oblivion. They studied mathematical texts from India and transferred the knowledge to Europeans. They adopted techniques for papermaking from China. Through them, Europeans learned to make paper. In addition to building on the intellectual achievements of other cultures, scholars during the Golden Age in Baghdad made their own achievements. Nasir al-Din al-Tushi was one of the most celebrated Islamic scholars. He studied and wrote about Islamic law, astronomy, logic, ethics, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. An observatory built under his direction was the most advanced in the world and produced the most accurate astronomical charts. He studied the relationship between the lengths of the sides of a triangle and the angles. This laid the groundwork for making trigonometry a separate subject. Medical advances in hospital care improved in cities such as Cairo, while doctors and pharmacists studied for examinations for licenses that would allow them to practice medicine. Ibn Khaldun was well known for his historical accounts and is widely acknowledged as the founder of the fields of historiography and sociology. Sufi poet and mystic Aisha may be the most prolific female Muslim writer before the 20th century. Her best-known work, a long poem honoring Muhammad called Clear Inspiration on Praise of the Trusted One, refers to many previous poets, reflecting her broad knowledge. Many of her works describe her journey toward mystical illumination. Aisha's poetry reflects a contrast between most Muslims and Sufis. Unlike Muslims who focused on intellectual pursuits, such as the study of the Quran, Sufis emphasized introspection to grasp truths that they believed could not be understood through learning. Sufism may have begun as a mystical response to the perceived love of luxury by the early Umayyad Caliphate. Sufi missionaries played an important role in the spread of Islam. They tended to adapt to local cultures and traditions, sometimes interweaving local religious elements into Islam, and in this way they won many converts. Helping to power the golden age of natural and moral philosophy and the arts was commerce. Islamic society viewed merchants as more prestigious than other societies, like in Europe and Asia at the same time. Muhammad himself had been a merchant, as had his first wife. With the revival of trade on Silk roads, merchants could grow rich from their dealings across the Indian Ocean and Central Asia. They were esteemed as long as they maintained fair dealings and gave to charity in accord with the pillars of the Islamic faith. Some merchants were even sent out as missionaries. In the non-Arab areas of Islamic expansion, controlled by Islamic caliphs led to discrimination against non-Arabs, though rarely to open persecution. This discrimination gradually faded in the 9th century. The caliph's soldiers were forbidden to own territory they had conquered. The presence of a permanent military force that kept order but did not own property allowed life for most of the inhabitants of the countryside to remain virtually unchanged as they were conquered. However, people did pay tribute to Islamic caliphs rather than to the old Byzantine rulers. Here is a pyramid depicting the Muslim society. So at the top of it were Muslims born to Islam. Below that became converts. After that are people of the book. People of the book were Jews and Christians. So they are going to be right here. And then you had slaves and non-Muslims, and we'll talk about slavery on the next slide. But it's important to understand that under all of these, this was just for men. This is a very patriarchal society. So this was only, for men. Women fell below here, which, is actually better in European hierarchy. At one point in the 1200s, it was thought that women, in terms of God's love, fell below cattle. So this was a marked improvement. Men were subservient, or women were subservient to men, but better off than Chinese women at the time. They had marriage, property rights, and family rights, as we're going to see later on. Although Islam allowed slavery, Muslims could not enslave other Muslims. Also exempt from slavery were Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Slaves were often imported from Africa, Kievan Russia, and Central Asia, but the institution of hereditary slavery had not developed. Many slaves converted to Islam, after which their owners freed them. Slave women might find themselves serving as concubines to Islamic men who already had wed their allotment of 4 wives. Slave women were allowed more independence, for example, to go to markets and to run errands, than the legal wives. Only slave women were permitted to dance or perform musically before unrelated men. This opportunity to earn money sometimes enabled female slaves to accumulate enough to buy their freedom. Some practices now associated with Islam were common cultural customs in Central Asia and the Byzantine Empire before the time of Muhammad. For example, women often covered their heads and faces. Men often wore head coverings from turbans to skull caps. While women could study and read, they were not to do so in the company of men not related to them. Muhammad raised the status of women in several ways. He treated his wives with love and devotion. He insisted that dowries, the payment prospective husbands made to secure brides, be paid to the future wife rather than to her father. He forbade female infanticide, the killing of newborn girls. Muhammad's first wife was educated and owned her own business, which set a pattern for recognition of women's abilities. Overall, Islamic women enjoyed a higher status than Christian or Jewish women. Islamic women were allowed to inherit property and retain ownership after marriage. They could remarry if widowed, and they could receive a cash settlement if divorced. Under some conditions, a wife could initiate a divorce. Moreover, women could practice birth control. Islamic women who testified in court under Sharia law were to be protected from retaliation, but their testimony was worth only half of that of a man. One gap in the historical record is written evidence of how women viewed their position in society. Most of the records created before 1450 were written by men. The rise of towns and cities in Islamic ruled areas resulted in new limitations on women's rights, just as it did in other cultures. The new status of women might be best symbolized by the veil in the harem, a dwelling set aside for wives, concubines, and the children of these women. Shortly after the death of Muhammad, the Islamic Empire began to conquer all over the area. The first dynasty of the Arab Empire was called the Umayyad dynasty, and it was located in Syria, modern-day Syria. But over time, that dynasty began to decline and was defeated in the Middle East. But the Umayyads continued to rule longer in Spain. In 711, after Muslim forces had defeated Byzantine armies across North Africa, they successfully invaded Spain from the south. They designated Cordoba as their capital for Spain. The Islamic military continued to push north, but it was turned back at the Battle of Tours in 732 when it lost against Frankish forces. That's people from France. This defeat, rare for Islamic armies during the 700s, marked the limit of rapid Islamic expansion into Western Europe. Most of the continent remained Christian, but Muslims ruled Spain for the next 7 centuries. Like the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Umayyad rulers in Cordoba created a climate of toleration, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisting peacefully. They also promoted trade, allowing Chinese and Southeast Asian products to enter into Spain, and thus into the rest of Europe. Many of the goods in this trade traveled aboard ships called dhows. These ships, first developed in India or China, had long, thin hulls that made them excellent for carrying goods, though less useful for conducting warfare. The Islamic State in Spain became a center of learning. Cordoba had the largest library in the world at that time. Among the famous scholars from Spain was Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes. He wrote influential works on law, secular philosophy, and the natural sciences. The Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in Spain, all people of the book as Muslims regarded them, not only tolerated one another, but also influenced one another. For example, Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle influenced the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. Maimonides developed a synthesis of Aristotle's reasoning and biblical interpretation. He, in turn, influenced Christian philosophers, including St. Thomas Aquinas. Islamic scholarship and scientific innovations, along with knowledge transferred from India and China, laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and scientific revolution in Europe. For example, making paper, a technology developed in China and taught to Europeans by Muslims, was vital to spreading ideas in Europe. Unit 1 is called the Global Tapestry to suggest that world history is a complex interweaving of different threads from different parts of the world at different times. However, to fully appreciate the whole, historians try to unravel the tapestry thread by thread to see just how each fits in. As they do, they use such historical concepts as change, continuity, perspective, cause and effect, significance, and empathy. Applying these concepts, they come to understand historical developments and patterns of changes or growth over time. To see these patterns, they look at subjects in historical context. How did they start out? What did they become over time? Historians also try to understand the historical processes that made certain developments possible, such as migration, industrialization, conquest, and, as we've seen here, state building.